Hey Hector, how are you?
Sorry, I didn't have the hi. Sorry, I didn't have this on.
Nice. Hey, yeah, perfect.
Hi,
I can see
Christoph.
you.
Nice to see
How are
you.
you? Very good to see you. How are you doing?
Well, very well. Let's see.
Nice. And you're in Zaragoza at the moment?
I'm in a little village in Teruel, in the mountains.
Ah, okay, nice.
I'm in Zaragoza University, but now I'm at home, which is in a very
Okay,
small
nice.
village. Yeah, lost in the mountains. So
Oh,
I,
that's
I,
lovely.
I need to warn you to that my connection
Yeah,
here is very erratic sometimes because of where I live. If something fails, uh,
yeah.
let Michael Walker keep going because he knows my stuff.
Okay.
We work
Yeah.
together, and then I reconnect. I hope that
Okay.
it doesn't happen, but
Yeah.
just in case. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's good to know. But I think we'll be able to deal with it. And yeah, just so you know, so Carl has a commitment, so we need to finish a little earlier than usual at 4
That's fine.
p.m.
No problem.
But I think it should be good.
Okay, good.
Um, do you maybe just want to try sharing your screen
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
just to be sure that that works?
So we have 30 minutes, right?
I mean, actually a bit more. But I mean, it depends. If you can,
It's because
if you,
if Carl is leaving because he had an interest in this,
yeah.
he's leaving at 4, you said, like in 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because
If
maybe
you have,
we we could skip
oh no, no,
some
no.
part.
Sorry. We're in a different time zone. Sorry, 1.5 hours. It'll be
So,
in 1.5 hours.
okay,
He
that's
leaves.
perfect.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
do have we
yeah,
have
yeah, yeah,
plenty of time then. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
yeah, that's true. I mean, I was thinking in Spanish
Sorry about
time.
that.
That was half an hour. Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't realize that either. So
No.
we have some
It
time.
was my mistake. No problem.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I just had to switch rooms.
Okay.
That's perfect. Yeah, your screen sharing works well. And
Yes, it is.
then I
Let's
think
see.
also Carl should be here any second.
Okay.
And also hello to everyone else. And I'll just be back in 1 second.
Daniel, Michael, it's good to see you.
Yes, good to
I
see
am
you.
Hughes.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Hector. And Idris.
Thanks for making it, all of you.
Perfect. And Carl should be here any second as well. And then we can kick it off. And I believe Carl has arrived, so I think we can start with the meeting. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's meeting. I'm Christoph. I'll be chairing this talk. Just to note that it will be recorded and made publicly available. Just email us if you prefer it for it to remain private. The structure of the meeting is the same as always. So we start with a roughly 40-minute presentation, followed by a Q&A from the audience. and ending with a feedback and discussion section with Carl. The meeting today is a little bit shorter than usual, so we'll have a hard stop at 4 p.m. So I would just, out of practicality, probably just suggest that if the discussion is going a little longer than works for you, Carl, or depending on how much you want to say, just turn on your camera to indicate that that you would like to commence your part. But I'm also trying to keep an eye on making the time parts fairly equal. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Héctor Manrique. He's a professor of developmental psychology at the University of Zaragoza in Spain, and he's approaching the study of human cognition from an evolutionary developmental perspective. And this is just a friendly reminder to try and turn on cameras, think of questions, ideas, and comments for the Q&A for later. This is really supposed to be an open environment for interaction, and we love to see everyone participate. So without further ado, I pass it on to you, Héctor. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. Thank you for having me. I'm going to try to share this big screen. So I'm going to talk about novelty and surprise, but the main goal of this talk, this is the things, I will come to this later. The purpose of this talk is discuss whether we can produce empirical evidence support for these ideas that I think are unique of active inference under the free energy principle. One is that generative models are entailed as opposed to being a structural representation of the environment. I think this is one of the main tenets of active inference, and one that I find very important. And also related to this, that recognition models are embodied. So this is, I think, a feature that has active inference that lack other predictive models or Bayesian brain frameworks. And if we could bring empirical evidence supporting this, I think it would be a step forward in defending active inference. So first of all, I'm going to talk about surprise and novelty to give some kind of background knowledge. And I'm going to basically copy and paste fragments from this article of Barto et al., which is one of favorite of mine, and to give some ideas about what we consider novelty and surprise, because then I will come back to this when I finalize this talk. And then I will also quote some part of the paper by Ramstedt et al., where they defend this idea that generative models are entailed. And this is something that they emphasize, and I think that this is a very important idea. So let me just try to differentiate between novelty and surprise, which is something that sometimes people do not separate much. And novelty requires examining the contents of memory. So something is novel if we cannot find it in our memory, or if this memory trace is fading, so that we see that this is something, it's not so fresh in our memory, so to speak. Whereas surprise is the discrepancy between what is expected and what actually happens. More on this, sorry. So talking specifically about surprise, we can say, and this I'm quoting the paper by Barto et al., surprise requires a mechanism for comparing an expectation with actuality. Bayesian surprise is a measure of the difference between an observer's prior and posterior beliefs. And according to this theory, surprise is a measure of the discrepancy between beliefs before and after an observation. Also, something I found very interesting too, that Bayesian surprise is the result of learning, but not its direct cause. So it comes after the Bayesian update has taken place. And some other idea that I think is interesting to differentiate it from novelty is that something is surprising in relation to a model. So in order to talk about surprise, we need to have a model that affords some expectations. If we talk of novelty, again, the novelty of an observation is ascertained by examining the memory store of past observations. So something is novel in relation to our past experience. This is something that I find also very interesting too. Now, if we contrast both, I'm trying to make this comparison. Novelty is based on memory stores, whereas surprise is based on expectations. This, for me, would be the main distinction. Also, surprise, its core element is not the incoming item, but the predicted item. The incoming item can be either familiar or novel. This doesn't count. So something can be familiar, but still be surprising if it comes at a time that is not expected, for instance. Novelty and surprise also differ with respect to their relation to time. The expectations or predictions that underlie surprise have to do with the dynamic flow of events happening in time. This doesn't happen with novelty. So something can be novel with independence of how much time has elapsed. There is no timing here, but surprise is linked often to time. So something we expect it at a specific time. If it doesn't happen, this is surprising, for instance. Okay, both surprise and novelty increase an animal's level of arousal and direct this attention and enhance learning. This is something that they both share. Where novelty often supports the acquisition of representations, surprise supports the improvement of predictions. This, we could say that they have different roles. But if we talk, for instance, of neurotransmitters in the brain, both novelty and surprise release dopamine. So there is phasic release of dopamine. So also at the neurobiological level, we find some things that they share. Key feature of surprise depends on the occurrence model confidence, precision, and expectations. Surprise can occur even for familiar stimuli if the contextual expectation is violated. Triggers model updating and is closely linked to base and surprise, free energy, and information gain. Timing is important. Now, key features of novelty, to summarize, independent of a specific expectations in a given context, novel stimuli may not be surprising if no prediction was made. Novelty often elicits exploratory behavior or curiosity-driven learning, encoded as low prior probability or absence of a prior altogether, and is not linked to time. Now, this is just a little table where I have introduced some terms of base and brain treatments, just if you want to have a look. That's a bit of a summary of ideas. Okay, we can try to mix these two things, novelty and surprise. For instance, we can have something that is surprising, but is not novel. Imagine that you mistook salt for sugar in your tea. You have had tea before, you have had salt before, but this combination was not expected. Then it will be surprising, but it won't be novel. And we can have the opposite scenario, something that is novel, but is not surprising. You explore a new city you've never visited. You weren't predicting anything, so it's not surprising, but it is novel. Any feature you find is novel, but it's not surprising. So the interesting thing is that there are many commonalities with these two concepts, but then we can also find things that differentiate each other. So I think it's important that we try to make connections with, for instance, brain areas or brain circuits that could help us disentangle them. Now we come to the paper by Ramstedt et al. When they introduced this idea that generative models and active inference are entailed, are not a structural representation of the environment. I'm just quoting some phrases that I find very illuminating for you to. So we examine two contrasting interpretations. This is quoting the authors of these models. Structural representationalist, this is predictive processing theories. They have this structural representationalist view of generative models. And in active inference, there is this enactive interpretation. So in active inference, generative models are control systems, and they are not structural representations. In predictive processing, structural representation are also described as detachable, in the sense that they can be used by the agent to perform cognitive tasks offline. And 4, as affording representational error detection in a manner analogous to cartographic maps, which allows for coupled adaptive action in the world. In an active inference, this is active inference, the organism embodies the recognition density and entails the generative model as a control system. I think this is one of the main tenets of the paper. The recognition model is the embodied organism, in the sense that the physical states of the organism parameterize, embody, or encode the parameters of sufficient statistics of this density. Thus, the organism literally embodies the recognition model, and its patterns of action and perception enact the expectations of the generative model it entails. We'll come back to this later, because my idea of experiment has to do precisely with this idea, that the body embodies the recognition model. Okay, contrasting predictive processing and active inference, two kinds of generative models, externalist versus internalist interpretations. Predictive processing generally treats generative models as internal representations of an external world. These models aim to infer the hidden causes of sensory inputs by minimizing prediction error. This is we could call the representationalist stance. Active inference, on the other hand, has this enactivist reading, suggesting that a non-representational or instrumentally pragmatic role for generative models. These models are not necessarily about accurately representing an external world, but about enabling skillful interaction. This is what we can call the enactivist stance. Okay, to density recognition versus generative, there is a critical distinction between the two in active inference. Generative density, the agents refers to the agent's prior beliefs about the world and its sensory consequences, whereas recognition density is the approximate posterior used to infer hidden states. In predictive processing, this distinction is often blurred, reinforcing a more representationalist view. Active inference explicitly separates this, allowing generative models to be read as tools for action. This is key in active inference, not just truth tracking devices, but afford action, okay? Afford to have these policies. Action as inference versus perception as inference would be another big difference between these models. In predictive processing, action is often treated as a mechanism to reduce prediction error. It's active sampling, but the core focus is on perception as inference, whereas in active inference, action is itself a form of inference, integrated into the generative models. The agent selects actions that fulfill prior beliefs, that is, it's seeking preferred states, making behavior inherently goal-directed. Okay, normativity and goals. Predictive processing generative models are often normatively neutral. There is no prescription. They aim to model the environment as accurately as possible. Whereas active inference generative models encode preferences or goals, priors over outcomes, making the system inherently normative. It acts to fulfill its own predictions. This is another main difference between these treatments. Okay, and now I just introduced this information because what I'm trying to find, and this is something that I don't know if I can succeed here, and that's why I would like to pick your brains. Is there a way that we can prove that generative models truly differ and find support for this idea that generative models are enacted and recognition models are embodied? Because if we could find empirical evidence, I think that would give support to the active inference in contrast to other predictive theories, predictive coding theories, predictive processing. So I'm just thinking in potential experiments. I'm going to share some musing of mine, some ideas of mine that are kind of tentative, and I don't know if they are even feasible. So we part from the idea that active inference is fundamentally an active inference. Generative models are not merely internal constructs, they are enacted. This insight, I believe, opens several intriguing conceptual avenues. These are my ideas. To anticipate an event, or more precisely, to bring forth a world in which that event becomes intelligible, I must orchestrate my body, muscles, nerves. I have to put everything in tune. And I think of this metaphorical like a safe. To open a safe, you need to dial the numbers. To recognize, for instance, a generative, to recognize an action, the recognition model, you should perhaps tune your body, your muscles, your wherever, all the parts of your body to be able to match what you're observing. This could be specific for this idea of generative models and recognition models being enacted and embodied. In predictive coding paradigms, by contrast, this combination is stored in abstract and modal format. So if generative models and generative and recognition models only capture regularity of the environment, in order to recognize this environment or this reality, we just need to find this matching structure. We can say that we can disentangle this entirely from our body. One is encoded in our brain, is encoded like zeros and ones. It's this kind of cognitivist representational view. So then our body would play a minor role, I would say. That's my speculation. And now I'm trying to think of examples in which we could find these differences. So let us imagine that we are spectators of a performance of the Nutcracker, this dance, and we seek to predict the dancer's next move, okay? What kind of surprise have we experienced? How might that differ depending on whether our perceptual model is enacted or a model? So under predictive coding, surprise is a function of error, of deviation from expected sensory input. If both observers, let's imagine that we have a ballet-obsessed art critic trying to anticipate the moves of the dancer, and Rudolf Nureyev, an expert dancer. So he has the knowledge, but also the body that can perform those very moves. They are equally familiar with the Nutcracker. Then, at least in theory, we should register similar levels of surprise if we consider predictive processing, predictive coding, because the knowledge has been stored in their brains in kind of a modal way. But if we think of an active inference, the equation should change, because here surprise is not merely the deviation from an anticipated sensory pattern. It's a dissonance in embodied action. So the critic, no matter how many times he has watched the ballet, lacks the sensory motor depth to produce the sequence of movement with precision. Nureyev, by contrast, knows the combination not as memory, but as body coordinates. So I'm thinking about, again, about this safe metaphor. So thus we encounter or reach a deeper form of surprise, one that arises not from what is unexpected, but from what is enactable. So my idea is we can have surprise by the move is not expected, because we have seen that ballet thousands of times. But can we have an additional surprise that comes from we not being able to perform those moves? That's kind of my idea. I don't know if that's even possible. So there should be a surprise that emerges not from the unpredictability of the world, but from the limits of our embodied capacity to reproduce it. So if we recognize things because we can embody these things, recognition model is embodied, could this play in the way we recognize reality also? Could give us some kind of different way of recognizing what we expect. So all humans, by virtue of our shared morphology, can in principle dial in the body safe code. Yet only a few, elite dancers, gymnasts, acrobats, can perform the precise sequence needed to unlock the vault of high complexity movement. Their familiarity is not observational, but also generative, not cognitive, but also corporeal. So what I seek here is, can we find a way to characterize different shades or flavors of surprise? If we could demonstrate a richer palette of surprise, each linked to different facets of embodied prediction, we may offer powerful empirical support for active inference under the free energy principle. So the recognition model is the embodied organism, as I understand it in active inference, in the sense that the physical state of the organism parameterizes this density. Thus, the organism literally embodies the recognition model, and its patterns of action and perception enact the expectation of the generative model it entails. This is the main tenet that they defend in this paper, and I think which is the core idea I want to pursue here. So that's my take on this. If organisms differ in terms of what they can physically enact, even across the same species, will they experience more or less surprise should they witness actions that can or cannot themselves embody? That's my main hypothesis, that I have no idea if this is the case, but this is what I would like to try to find empirically. So, and now I thought in a potential thought experiment or empirical experiment to try to disentangle these generative models in different treatments. Imagine that we are watching a famous ballet play, and at some unspecified time, the sequence of moves is altered by interspersing a dance routine that it doesn't belong. This causes surprise since it violated the expectation of the viewer. In a way, this should be equally surprising to anyone that knows the ballet, with independence of whether this observer can embody the watch movement sequence. This would not surprise someone who lacks any predictions, someone that has never watched any ballet, so we need at least to be familiar with the ballet. We should expect higher surprise in an athlete that could enact the ballet moves despite not being himself a dancer in relation to the dance critique and the expert ballet dancer who had previous expectations about what comes next. So, and the predictive coding, we shouldn't find differences. The difference would have to do with whether you know the ballet or not. Now, let's imagine a new motor routine where the performer executes actions that are extremely demanding in terms of body endurance. Here, the dance critique should exhibit higher surprise when compared with both the ballet dancer and the athlete, since all three are equally ignorant of what comes next, yet the critique lacks the body preparation to embody it. This if we accept generative models are entailed and recognition are embodied. So just to finalize this, the point I want to make is if there is something unique in relation to entailing, enacting the generative models and embodying the recognition models, there should also be something unique in the brain that encodes the possibility or not to embody witnessed motor routines. If generative and recognition models are instead structural representations that capture regularities of the environment and its contingencies, witnessing a professional dancer produces impossible movements will not be encoded differently in the brains of those who can embody those movements from the brains of those who cannot embody those movements, cannot perform them. And here I just thought some ideas of potential configurations of experimental groups to try to test these predictions, if this is even possible. So for instance, we could have this idea of having some people watching routines of dancers, for instance, or ballets, and then have different groups watching this. For instance, a critic dance expert who is well equipped in terms of prediction-wise, but ill-equipped in terms of body. He cannot enact this movement, embody this movement. Then we could have a professional dancer group that are well-equipped prediction-wise and well-equipped body-wise. And then a professional athlete that would be ill-equipped prediction-wise, he doesn't know ballets, but is well-equipped body-wise. So the main idea to finish this short presentation is it possible to find specific flavors of surprise in people that observe movements that they can predict, but they are unable to enact because they don't have the bodies. They have never performed them themselves. If we could find something in the brain that kind of marks this distinction, then I think this would be strong evidence supporting active inference under the free energy principle. And this is something I don't know if it is even possible. That was what I wanted to discuss with you today. And that's basically it.
Thank you very much, Hector, for this very soulful presentation. A quick unmute and round of applause, please.
Thank you.
And I shall now, I shall now open the stage to comments and questions. Maybe we can, Andreas, please. Yes.
Thank you for really well-focused and deeply significant, I guess, question and topic. In terms of the flavors of surprise, I do think that's quite revealing. And the way I look at emotional life is in terms of expectations and, the responses. And so what that shows quite directly is that, if you have an expectation about something not so important to you, like maybe, beyond your body, beyond yourself, You'll feel surprise if it doesn't bear out, but you'll feel excitement if it does. But see, if it's important to you, like if it relates to your sweetheart or maybe your body or something, you're not going to feel surprise. You're going to feel sadness, okay? Or you'll feel contentment, like everything's all right. And there's no spectrum between surprise and sadness. There's a chasm between surprise and sadness. So this difference between like, what do we know about the outside world? What do we know about the inside world? There's a huge chasm. There's a double system. If we can't make expectations and it's coming from the outside, we can't make them because it's too fast or too strange or something we just wouldn't want to do, right? We're frightened. But if it comes from the inside, it's disgusting, you see. And so this simple fact just shows like just how little is known about emotional life. Like people argue that it's coming from the body. But I was able to give you 6 emotions that are more pure than your body will ever make you feel, because it's absolutely cognitive. Now, so in terms of the question you had, the models, it's basically maybe like, and your experimental approach is fantastic, but there's really like 4 different models. And one is maybe, saying, okay, whatever's going on in the world, it becomes digital, right? That's hard to believe, I think, But I think in terms of predictive processing, the outcome would be, there's something in the world and we make abstractions of it. But if that was true, we would probably have layers of abstraction, you see. So there could be like 5 layers or 7 layers, it gets more and more abstract. And you see, maybe there's something like that in the retina or whatever, but that's what it would predict, I think. What active inference is suggesting, you see, and what you're you're suggesting, I think there's 2 ways then to look at it. The way you're looking at it, saying that active inference is really inactive. So in a certain sense, like it's happening through. But another way of looking at that is that no, that all the evidence for the embodied mind is evidence for the disembodying mind. The history of evolution is that you get more and more and more profoundly removed from the world. It just becomes, and like we're just setting tiny parameters of behavior. But the parameters that we're saying, and so basically, it's not that the generative model is making abstractions. The generative model is creating a world of maybe 100,000 concepts, 100,000 cortical columns that is matching what 100 billion neurons are doing. The 100 billion neurons tell you what you know, okay? And so this qualia type of feeling is something that every worm feels. But the generative model is telling you what you don't know. I don't know this. And so you get black boxes, you get the networks. Now, if this is the case, then you should be able, and they're all aligned very fine, there should be a third mind that lets you align them and then lets you decide, do I want to be embodied or do I want to be disembodied? I think all the evidence, like we do that every day. Like we choose, like, do we want to do it or do we want, like, do we want to plan ahead rationally and do it step by step, or do we want to just, intuitively say, I love you, right? So that's the 4th model. See, so I predict that your experimental will be very revealing, but that's a nutshell of how I think about it.
Okay, thank you, Andrews. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that emotions are a very promising also field of research here. The thing is that there are things you cannot embody. For instance, I cannot embody a call. I cannot embody a car. So expectations are kind of external to my body. I don't filter them through my body. But other people's moves, I can either predict them in kind of this cognitivist way, is something I recognize, and this myriad of neurons activating tell me that this is the action I was expecting or not. So I just think if it's possible that when you are able to embody, there is something distinctive in your brain, that is not just this myriad of neurons. But again, Andrews, I have no clue if this is even possible. But because I don't know how we could find this flavor surprise as markers in your brain. I mean, there are techniques, but I don't know. For instance, dopamine, I don't think it's significant in this case. We should find some kind of very precise markers. But these experiments of mine are very kind of, it's been a bit of a brainstorm. I should.
If I could just follow, I think the emotion you're describing is amazement, and I think like by this analysis, it'd be a double expectation, so, okay, it's surprising what they do for many possible, so depending on, it's really just what expectation was there. And it may not be surprising, but the idea that it becomes, we expect certain things are possible, right? Like, so I watch a movie or something, I go, I start to realize like I could never do that, but they do it. And so there's all these emotions, you see. And so the amazement can have different flavors, like you say. It can be a sad amazement. It can be a content amazement. It's like an exciting amazement. It could be a surprising. It could be frightful. It could be disgusting. Like, because you have two expectations. And it's the algebra of those expectations that another thing, and I wrote up, like, I studied poetry. Like, so poetry is data for moods. And moods is something that people have no idea how to do. But really, like, what the poetry shows is that it's all about boundaries between that self and the world. And you're basically playing with those boundaries. So you see, if something's funny, it's because you took something that was sad and you changed the boundary and it became surprising. Okay. But that's very problematic because you made yourself smaller, right? So it could be not a good thing to do, if you do it intentionally or whatever. So anyway, so that's just to say, I think what you're doing is very rich, and we'll see what you do. That's good.
Thank you, Andrews. You know what I said now is this double amazement would come in this, in the athlete, for instance. It's amazed because he's not expecting it, but it's not double amazing because he can perform the moves. That's what I was thinking of, if this is even possible. And regarding poetry, that's very interesting. And John Keats said about Shakespeare that the success of Shakespeare was that things were kind of surprising all the time. And this is something that I said the other day. It was in a talk with Luca, with Jeremy Holmes, and he put up this very nice example how keeping things open and surprising might be some secret of Shakespeare, for instance. And he linked with active inference. I really enjoyed that talk. And I think that's poetry is really exciting also because of that ambiguity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Chris, your comment.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Hector. That was very interesting. I thought of two things during your talk. One was in your contrast with predictive coding. I think a thing to bring up in the contrast between predictive coding as sort of an abstract piece of theory and active inference is that active inference recognizes the existence of a Markov blanket. And the Markov blanket limits the system's perceptions to the environment's actions. So all the system knows about the environment is what the environment does to it. And its basis for modeling is just what the environment does to it. And I think that's a huge difference from the kind of view from nowhere predictive coding thinking. And it essentially enforces this kind of embodied and activist view of a system because you have this restriction that's extremely strong on what the system can know. So that was my first comment. It's just kind of a methodological comment. The second comment was that when you describe this contrast between a person who can enact emotion and a person who can't, or a person who can enact an emotion and a person who can't. These are the sorts of things that what used to be called the mirror neuron system used to do. And I mean, that concept has been very thoroughly criticized in various ways, but there's still the phenomenology of systems that fire on observation and on action. And it would seem to me that that would be an ideal system to try to focus on to do the experiment that you're describing. And you might have to do it, in an fMRI machine or something like that to see if there's a distinction between people who can mirror an action and people who can't mirror an action. And that difference could be highly specific. So thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Chris. I agree completely with you. And in fact, I also was thinking of the mirror system. And there are lots of experiments with the mirror system and recognition of actions. That's the first thing they observed with macaques. They attributed to this being able to recognize the action. But what I'm wondering is whether we can link some signal or mark of surprise in the brain with this. I don't know if this you can do with the mirror system kind of experiments. But this is hypothetical. I don't have this work out. This was the purpose of this, was to make a brainstorm. But I agree with you, this mirror system. But is there something specific that happens in your brain that we can measure when there is a type of surprise that has to do with you not being able to embody what you observe? So I guess that maybe the mirror system itself is that. I don't know. I'm just thinking if in the brain there is some more rich palette of signals that we can exploit, but I don't know.
Well,
but I agree with what you said. I mean,
yeah, one way to think about it, I think, going back to your point, your core point about embodiment. I mean, if we can think of the generative model as, and I think this was stated in the paper that you referenced by Maxwell, et cetera, and Carl, the dynamics of the system is what's implementing the generative model, and the dynamics of the system is implementing surprise. And we may or may not experience a different kind of surprise, but our overall system is detecting a different pattern of activity, registering that different pattern of activity as an input to be dealt with, differentially depending on whether the mirror system is activated or not, because you're looking at the total brain state. So I think in a sense our experience is secondary, and what the nervous system is actually dealing with in terms of state transitions is what's important.
Okay. I mean, I think I know what you mean, but then would it be possible to find these dynamics that we can register in the brain that tell you that generative models are indeed entailed, as opposed to representations of contingencies? That is kind of my main focus. But maybe you answered that. I didn't understand it properly.
Chris, do you have another comment to this? Otherwise, also Magdalena, I think, had her hand raised for a bit.
No, you can move on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the comments, Chris. Yeah, Magdalena,
Yes.
please.
Hi, thank you, Héctor. That was really interesting. I appreciate it. Actually, Chris, I'm curious as to your last point. Could you rephrase it? Because I think there was something there that what I'm thinking about connects to what you were saying. Oh, he's not there. Okay. So
Oh, I think he is. Sorry,
He is there, but perhaps Chris.
Was that a comment to me? I'm sorry.
yeah,
Yes,
I think so,
a
yeah.
question from Magdalena.
Yes.
Sorry, Chris, I was wondering if you could elaborate on your last point, because I think my point, it relates to what you said. So if you could just rephrase.
Well, I said that whether a subject experiences a qualitatively different kind of surprise may be a very coarse-grained, low-resolution sample of the dimensions of surprise that the brain is actually responding to. So if we think of surprise as just some collection of components of the brain state, how many components? Who knows? Hundreds of thousands, maybe. And translating that into some gradation of experience may not capture what's actually functionally effective within the system. I mean, maybe it does in some people and doesn't in other people, but you would have to do another experiment to see how sensitive people are to different kinds of surprise. And there's probably a huge spectrum of variation, just like with everything else.
Thank you. I think my point is related to yours. As an anthropologist, I just wanted to ask Héctor, right? So the experiment with a ballet, I think is along the lines of what Chris is referring to. I think that it's very coarse-grained, and that in that situation, trying to isolate what's happening at the level of what I'm hearing is that, you know, in humans we have physical intelligence as well as cognitive intelligence, right? And that within the human body, those systems are incredibly hyper-coordinated. They work together. So for example, what I say to my students is like this, is, you know, I don't think that Einstein could have come up with an equation like E equals mc squared if he had a little p under his foot, right? Because that would be really annoying, and, you know, so there's physical things that really interfere with how we interact with the world, how we feel the world. And in the case of, if you could, you know, I don't know, maybe it's not necessary, but in the ballet example, I could see surprise everywhere when you were talking about it. The dancers are surprised. The dancers who are doing the dances are picking up on every little thing that every other dancer is doing. The audience, the athlete, the professional dancer is surprised because, wow, this one dancer did something that I had not expected for that particular sequence. The athlete may actually be completely checked out and have no surprise at all, feel absolutely nothing. And so those are all possibilities. Why the athlete might not feel anything? Well, because the athlete doesn't really understand what it means to dance and be on your pointed toes and stuff like that. So for them, it's like, just like when I go to a football game, I'm not surprised because I find that all I see is bodies running. Makes no sense. So to me, it's like a movie. Oh, okay. I don't know. I'm not even knowledgeable enough to know that was a really important point, that kind of thing. So I think that when it comes to trying to get at something, at these very subtle distinctions between surprise and activity, embodiment, etc., all of that, we can put it all in tacit knowledge. And we don't really understand what tacit knowledge is, but it's like that thing that we have. And, you know, in active inference, how do we work with that? That I know a lot more that I can articulate. That's the human experience. We can always know a lot more than we can articulate. And that knowing more is our memories, our experiences, etc., plus all these other aspects of active inference, which is kind of breaking up the world into operationalizable, if you will, components of cognition. So the MRI suggestions seem like that might be a better way to isolate these things. That was my comment.
Thank you, Magdalena. Well, I mean, for all of you to know, this is some brainstorm that I sent to Professor Freestone, and it was kind of my musings, but I was not sure if this had been done already with these people that work with mirror system. So I'm not sure that I'm proposing something new, or I'm not aware of experiments that have tested this before. But just to try to make it more precise, imagine that you are an athlete, okay? Or you are not acquainted with dancing, with a ballet. You will experience more surprise than someone that has seen that ballet many times. But if you start to rewatch that ballet thousands of times, you will habituate. So your response will decrease. You won't be surprised anymore. My idea is, could it be that if you don't have the body of an athlete or a dancer, you will never subtract surprise entirely, because there will always be a remain that is specific to having your body attuned. That's what I'm trying to see if that is possible, because then you could subtract surprise completely in an athlete, because he will cease to be surprised because he's expecting everything after watching it 1,000 times, and his body is tuned completely with the moves. So there is no surprise left. And hypothetically, this is elucubration. Hypothetically, if you don't have a body that is prepared to do that, maybe you cannot subtract completely the surprise. There is some reminiscent surprise that we can tap onto. That's the idea, but I don't know if that is possible. That is what I want to convey here too, that is a brainstorm. But that's the main kind of idea I had in mind.
Yeah, maybe it also helps, Hector, if you put on slide 21, A Tale of Two Densities again, because I think there you've also put some questions again, just to remind everyone. And Andreas, yeah, please.
Which one did you refer?
What you feel, because I think either this one. Oh yeah, maybe this one's better. Yeah, I think this one's
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Thank you.
I think with regard to the particular things you're describing, whether or not a person's, about the person's relationship with their body, etc. I think that boundary between sadness and surprise is very relevant, because if I'm right, then sadness, you see, it's in terms of generative models, it's the difference between modeling everything we know, like the world, and then within that we model ourselves and our model, right? So and I think there was a recent talk about the screen, the mental screen, etc. I was trying to explain that I kind of think of that as this chasm. It kind of denotes the chasm. So like when you're imagining stuff, let's say in your mind, you're basically dealing with the types of things you would see in the world. But there's this stuff that is much more personal. And so this personal stuff, if you have been a dancer, maybe you got in an accident, or if you're invested in dancing for different reasons, maybe your wife is a dancer. If you have that personal investment, you may feel not surprise, but you may feel sadness at certain points, right? Like you may feel sadness that you won't feel surprised that they didn't do a perfect move. You'll feel sadness. Oh, that I was hoping that they would do it better. Or you may feel sadness that, I realize that my body could never do that, or whatever, or you could feel contentment of, that somebody else could do that. So that distinction between sadness and surprise, I think, would play with the things you're looking for.
So then, Andrews, maybe there could be an experiment that taps onto emotions to see whether you're able to embody those things or not.
Yeah, so maybe the point of this is to track not just surprise as an emotion, because also it's kind of odd that surprise isn't an emotion that's been around, but all of this math is using the notion of surprise, right? That's and I guess that's another difference between like backwards looking and forwards looking. There's no emotion in a backwards looking theory. So, and inactive theories are backwards looking. They're looking at the past, what's the sum of all the past. But Bayesian theories, or like active inference, they're forward looking. So you have to have emotions, and you have to have a double mind, and so you have to have, you know, this boundary between sadness and surprise. You have to have, and so they have this notion of time, like you say. And so that again speaks to this idea, like, well, to say that active inference is inactive inference, I distinguish between passive inference, active inference, and willful inference that would compare the two. But maybe just the thing I want to say was that in your experiments, if you don't just ask about surprise, but you ask about sadness or disgust or fright or some other emotions, I think then that would be interesting. Like that may give you the combinations that would be informative.
Okay, I haven't thought of that. Thank you. That's another point of view. Yeah, I never thought in using other kind of emotions. And what I thought of surprise, that maybe the distinction surprise novelty could be useful here, because when you have watched this ballet many times, you've got it in your memory. So it's not novel anymore, but might be surprising if you are not able to enact it. This is why I focus more or less in novelty and surprise. But
And then if you were to test the fact that if it is the case that people can choose between being in an active mode or being in a predictive mode, they should be able to choose the emotional consequences. And so novelty would be maybe something that's really prominent in the inactive mode. So are people able to look at something and just tune out all their emotions? And again, like if you're the person who's the dancer, again, the question, like when you're in the flow, I think emotions may not be helpful. Like, so you do force them out because they're just going to be disruptive, right? Like, so you're just into what you're doing. And so the ability to people to maybe willfully control that would be evidence for something.
interesting. I should need to think it more. Yeah, but that emotional take is interesting. Thank you, Andrews.
Thank you, Andreas. Are there any more thoughts for the moment? Also maybe specifically on the slide or the setup of the potential experiment. And also just quickly want to point out that Daniel has made some very useful and interesting comments via the chat. But those will also be available afterwards. Maybe if there are no thoughts at the moment, I can just briefly share like some quick thoughts of mine. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I mean, maybe also one thing to consider that I would say, if I'm not mistaken, that novelty is not necessarily absence of prediction, but I think can be formalized just as a flat prior on imprecise prior. And whereas surprise typically comes with a more precise prior, so a clearer expectation, which I think can also help thinking about these things. And yeah, I thought the topic's extremely interesting, and also the sort of pitting the two views against one another, the representationalist stance and an activist stance, especially also when taking a step back, kind of from Mars, different levels, which I think has been like Krakauer 2016 has written a very interesting paper about Mars levels and how to approach sort of explaining complex organisms. And the really interesting key takeaway, I thought, was the line sort of starting with why, the computational problem. What is the organism trying to solve, and how do its behavior or functions help it solve that problem? And I feel like that, I don't know, it puts this discussion also in a very interesting light, because the sort of inferential process, obviously its final goal must have something to do with helping the organism survive. So it must conceptually, and this is intuitively, be very closely bound with helping it sort of decide policy, helping it in policy decisions and everything, because pure representation has no end in itself. So I just thought that's sort of interestingly baked into this as well. And then I thought your idea of an experiment and the thought of subtracting sort of the enacted element, I thought very interesting. Thought was very interesting. What's probably difficult is in the idea that you mentioned, that someone that has performed something, or that would be my assumption, and I'm probably the least qualified on the call to make a clear comment on this. But that would be my assumption, that someone that has actually physically performed something will always know it better than someone that even has just visually like seen it a lot. And I guess that could be a huge confounder in the levels of surprise. Simply, if you kind of know the movements from a different perspective, which not necessarily provide clear proof for one on the other direction. And and I was just thinking potentially of a direction of, on the one hand, trying to simplify greatly the sort of the activity that people are doing, because obviously ballet is extremely complex, and there can be a lot of confounds with, it's just the more complex it gets, the harder it becomes. And on the other hand, also maybe changing the directionality of sort of where we're finding the substrate of the enacted element. And I was just wondering, for example, learning a simple physical action, like this is quite a party stopper, this move. It's like a piano, like, I don't know, but it's very simple, and people typically don't know it unless they learn it. And then combining that with sorry, I don't want to talk too long about this, but potentially combining it with a TMS shock to the motor cortex, and seeing how basically the inability to use one's motor system in predicting the sequence affects surprise. Although, to be honest, I don't know. I'm also just trying to brainstorm and think out loud. I think there are probably a lot of problems with this. But yeah, just as an idea to throw out there.
Thank you, Christoph. That's a good idea, and we are on the same page. I'm just brainstorming too. For me, the main challenge would be to find the dependent variable. What are we to measure? To subtract. But the idea is what you say, is subtract. Is something that we can subtract when you are able to perform what you watch. And if so, which would be a good dependent variable to register that can tell this apart? And I was also thinking that you can have someone that is unable to walk. He was born with a problem with the legs, and he never was able to move them, but he has lots of experience seeing people walking. So he has spent his whole life seeing people walking, but he has never walked himself. That would make a difference in terms of recognizing or predicting actions that had to do with walking. I know this sounds very naive, but that's the kind of the idea, that you can have more simple things to observe. But the problem is there a marker, a specific marker to this surprise that comes from not being able to embody that yourself? That's the idea. I don't know if that's even possible. So I'm like you, I'm just brainstorming. So the experts are those guys. So that's what in fact, I don't even plan to do this experiment, but I don't have the lab. There was just kind of intellectual inquiry, see if that's possible and someone can do it, because I think it would be important for the theory, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Magdalena, please. And then afterwards, I think we'll also slowly start going over to Carl, as the time is a bit shorter today. Magdalena, please, yeah.
Okay, just real quick. So Hector, I was thinking that maybe the ballet example, like it gives us some, and also the comments that were made. I think a ballet is actually very emotionally laden. So Andrea's comments were really made me think about your experiment. But if you're still thinking in terms of surprise and actually having entire humans involved in the experiment, that may be a physical activity that doesn't, that's not designed for emotional engagement. So I just had the thought. Thank you.
Yes, Magdalena, now that you say, and Andrews, that you are completely right. Maybe we have more confounding variables in ballet because your own experience or emotions associated to art, even if you are a lover of art or not, or you are a very practical person, this might perhaps add error variance. I don't know. So maybe it would be better to use some kind of more neutral moves or coordinated movements that are not normally associated with music or with emotions. So maybe it could be a routine of gymnastics, for instance, that is not so emotional, it's not linked to, I don't know, Tchaikovsky or 19th century romanticism. But that's a good point. I mean, experimentally, maybe it would be cleaner to have something that is more neutral, unless we want to take advantage of emotion to find our surprise. And so, but that's something we need to consider as a variable, something we can manipulate in purpose. Otherwise, it will be error, variance error. Yeah, but that's a good point. Thank you, Magdalena.
Thank you, Magdalena. And last comment by you, Andreas.
Yes, quickly. I'm wondering, what you're doing is very sophisticated, but if maybe a first experiment could just be something much more simple, like I'm thinking, is it possible in an fMRI machine that a person could be asked to tap their finger, and they tap their finger, and then all of a sudden the thing underneath the finger disappears? Now that would be surprising, right? And I'm just curious then what lights up in the brain, and you would have some kind of baseline. And then is that enough to distinguish these two theories, or these two approaches?
I don't know, Andrews. I mean, what you say is interesting, and because you're putting a surprise that is not to do with performing the act. But the fact that I thought in something very complex is that it will be impossible to subtract some level of surprise because many of us will not be able to do it. So an athlete can do it, even if he's not familiar with ballet. That was the idea of using these complex moves, that we can get to a point where we cannot subtract more surprise if you are an average person, because you were never able to perform those very specific moves. But I guess the idea might be tested with more simple paradigms. We would need to think about it. But again, as you said, using emotions could be an interesting avenue. I mean, it would be something to explore also.
Thank you so much for this lively discussion. And I'm sorry, Carl, for going a little long. And I do believe it is your turn now.
It's my turn now, is it?
I think so.
Okay, very good. Yeah, excellent discussion. And I'm not going to rehearse all of it, but just pick up on some more technical themes in the service of in writing up this paper, just referring back to some of the foundational literature and just highlighting the potential for practically performing a study of this kind, although I do know that Hector may not be able to actually do it, but he certainly needs to be able to refer to the appropriate empirical literature to say that it is doable. So I'm going to just answer the questions at a fairly practical level. And I should say, I am going to take this as motivated by Bayesian surprise. So we're not talking about propositional or vernacular surprise or emotions, experiencing. We're not interested in, I'm not going to be interested in the really challenging and interesting issues that attend the phenomenology of surprise. I'm just talking about Bayesian surprise. And as usual, if I can grab the screen, I'll just pick up on a few papers that remind me to make some sort of technical points. If I can share that. Yep, excellent. Okay, whoops, that's a little preemptive. Just to pick up on a phrase that was used earlier on about the ambiguity that attends Bayesian surprise. I think that's something, Hector, that should be massively foregrounded in a very particular way, which speaks to the distinction between the representationalist predictive processing perspective that does not address the engagement with a world across a boundary, screen, or blanket. And that is the role of Bayesian surprise, read as the divergence between a posterior and a prior in perception relative to action. So this quantity, which is quite a crucial quantity, is a KR divergence between your posterior beliefs and your prior beliefs. It is, in the context of belief updating, given some sensory evidence, that's the same as the complexity that is minimized in self-evidencing. So in perception, in the belief updating that is induced by some sensory information from the world, you will minimize Bayesian surprise because you want to minimize complexity provided the accuracy is maintained. Exactly the opposite happens when it comes to action. In action, that complexity now has to be evaluated under expectations, predictive posteriors, about the observations that you would see if you acted like this. And that's where you get the move from a variational free energy to an expected free energy. That has the crucial effect of flipping around the KR divergence so that now you want to maximize Bayesian surprise. And that is, if you like, the way that people would read Bayesian surprise in salience. So, for example, in the visual search literature, Bayesian surprise was a concept, a terminology introduced by Etienne Baldi to explain why we are attracted to various positions in the visual scene when actively palpating that scene. And what we want to do is to maximize the information gain. So we want to maximize the distance between, or the divergence between our priors and our posteriors, having made that move. So I think, to me, this is a very beautiful distinction that, on the one hand, while perceiving, you're going to minimize Bayesian surprise. On the other hand, while acting, while choosing what to perceive, or choosing what to sense at least, you're trying to maximize Bayesian surprise. So there is an inbuilt ambiguity there, which explains why we are surprise seeking. We are novelty seeking, and yet we try to avoid surprise. So it resolves that deep paradox in the sense that one pertains to our sense making, and the other one pertains to our decision making. Within this information gain reading of Bayesian surprise, there are two flavors. So this is not Andy Barto's definition. This is the technical definition that comes along with the free energy principle and active inference. The salience associated with Bayesian surprise refers to the resolution of uncertainty, or the Bayesian surprise that you get in relation to time-dependent states of affairs in the world. So these are the hidden or the latent states. But you can also apply the Bayesian surprise, or the epistemic value, or the intrinsic motivation, however you want to read it, not to the states of affairs in the world, but to the contingencies that are parameterized by the generative model that is entailed when you act, or when you update your recognition model. And that's referred to as novelty. So although the maths is exactly the same, when you apply the maths to time-dependent inferences or time-dependent unknowns in the environment, states of affairs in the environment, that's referred to as salience in the spirit of Etienne Baldi's Bayesian surprise. When you apply it to the parameters that are not time-dependent, these are the contingencies, that's referred to as novelty. And I thought that fitted very beautifully with Hector's distinction between the time-dependent and the time-independent aspects, the qualitative distinctions between novelty and surprise that actually fall out of the maths when considering the composition of the expected free energy, where you're trying to maximize this divergence or this surprise or this resolution of uncertainty or information gain or relative entropy or Kullback-Leber divergence. These are all words for exactly the same thing. If you're in robotics, it'd be known as intrinsic motivation, also referred to as epistemic affordance, epistemic value, and intrinsic value. All words for exactly the same thing, but when applied to states, salience, when applied to parameters, contingencies, novelty. So this may or may not be relevant for the experiment, but it might be, given that you've got two aspects of this kind of Bayesian surprise in play, which was incidentally sort of referred to obliquely in terms of experienced ballet watchers no longer finding it very novel because they know all the rules, they know what's behind that door, which is different from, well, they know that they can open that door and these moves can be made, as opposed to opening that door and seeing what's there and resolving uncertainty about the states of the world. In terms of the dependent measure, I think, Hector, that's much simpler than you might think. It's just the amplitude of a mismatch response or a surprise response in the electroencephalogram or the magnetoencephalogram. And what that means is that you can interpret the brain activation measured in any way as a measure of Bayesian surprise. It is a measure of the metabolic cost that accompanies the belief update, and the belief update is measured by that KL divergence. So if I change my mind via the Zielinski equality and Landauer's principle, that costs energy. So the more I change my mind, technically the more I move, the greater distance I move on a statistical manifold, the more energy I have to expend, the more work I have to do. And that's what we measure with fMRI. And it's also what we measure with EEG. So the amplitude of the responses, both for fMRI and EEG, just scores the Bayesian surprise. Now, Hector, that doesn't answer your question fully, because where in the brain? And what we're going to find is exactly what you were discussing. It's going to be in the mirror neuron system. Chris has gone, so I can say that, well, perhaps he's still here. I was upset to hear that people have shouted at the mirror neuron system. In my world, the mirror neuron system is alive and kicking and underpins a lot of functional anatomy and a lot of experiments. And that distributed system is basically the system that represents the world in this intrinsically embodied way. It is sense-making when trying to infer the intentional stance and behavior of another thing that is like me. And that it's quite a large system. It includes the prefrontal cortex, the posterior superior temporal cortex, parietal cortex, and probably the anterior cingulate. So it's quite a lot of the brain, multimodal parts of the brain, which is called the mirror neuron system. And I would imagine that's where you will be looking. So Christoph was toying with the idea of getting in at the level of motor cortex. I think that's, you know, that would be one part of the mirror neuron system. But you could also look at other parts, particularly those parts of the brain, which you can see up here in the posterior temporal region, that are responsible for encoding biological motion. So biological motion is, you know, almost definitively the kind of motion that I can actually reproduce. So that's why it's part of the mirror neuron systems. That might be either another target for TMS, but I think given you don't have a lab and probably you don't have any friends who do TMS, it's probably the safest to stick to EEG studies. So what you're looking for in your terms of your dependent measure is the amplitude of an evoked response in one or more regions that constitute the mirror neuron system. And then that dependent measure then will have to be carefully motivated or predicted on the basis of your hypotheses. I'll just say now, cutting to the end, that you know, there was an interesting observation, I think from Andreas and Magdalena, that, you know, to be surprised, I have to have some expectations. So if I'm a complete ballet novice, nothing's going to surprise me. And that's mathematically perfectly okay, because you know, the difference that Bayesian surprise registered can move from a very broad distribution to a very narrow one, or it can move from a very narrow one to a very broad one. So by careful selection of what the experienced viewer is experienced at, I think you can argue for whether you think that they could be surprised, and if they're going to be surprised, and if they're going to be surprised in this nuanced way that it's about, could I have done that myself? Then I think you can easily motivate the use of EEG. This paper just demonstrates it formally using simulated EEGs during evoking surprises by presenting surprising words, but the maths is identical. If you wanted to read about the underlying theory and physics, this paper was about active listening as opposed to active viewing, but the maths is absolutely identical. I like this notion of sort of you call it corporeal. Corporeal computation. I think that's another big theme that would be nice to sort of foreground or surface the sort of key conceptual issues that you're dealing with. And it reminded me very much of mortal computation. It's substrate dependent, and beyond just being neuromorphic, it's actually embodied. The substrate really matters, and there's lots of discussion about that in the sort of machine learning and active inference literature, largely recently motivated by Alex Orabidia, revisiting a term introduced by Geoffrey Hinton called mortal computation. So I thought it was a nice parallel description of corporeal or embodied inference. That in itself speaks to another thing that I thought was important to emphasize. And Hector, I can't remember how you actually expressed it, but it did resonate exactly with the foundational literature in this area that linked active inference to the mirror neuron system through the joint explanations for belief updating whilst acting and whilst observing somebody else performing the same action. That's what they effectively and of course you can do that if you have a generative model of how I do that. You've also got a generative model of the visual consequences of you doing the same thing. So it's quite a natural natural sort of emergent property of anything that entails a generative model. But the other point you were making was the fact that more often than not, all the actual structure in terms of made acts, the way that we move, say that we dance, actually comes from the inside. It's not on the outside. We actually create, we author that metaphysics to provide the right kinds of sensations. So one sees this technically at many, many different levels. And this was something that sort of really struck one when doing the original simulations of the mirror neuron system and action observation. That too, sorry, yeah, this is the paper. This is the paper, but this is the figure I wanted. When you're creating movements like dancing and writing and walking, that you are creating that. There's nothing out there that's doing the walking. It is just your fantasy that you live in a world where your world, which includes your body, walks around. And all the interesting dynamics and all the interesting structure, literally based upon autonomous dynamics associated with chaotic systems or quasi-periodic dynamics, comes from the inside. That's always struck me as something which I keep reminding myself that we are the primary authors of our own sensorium, unlike many sessile objects, and certainly unlike a purely predictive representative, something that is sessile in the sense it can't move, but it can still ingest data and make sense of its world. So this paper actually simulates action observation. No, unfortunately, I can't find the figure. Anyway, but it might be worth a reread. It's a very early paper, but it does introduce all the fundamentals I think you would need to tell the story you want to tell. The other reason I put this up is just to highlight the work of James Kilner in this space. So James went on And James went on and unpacked active inference as a way of understanding the functional anatomy of the mirror neural system. So he was a close colleague of Rizzolatti and colleagues, and one of the experts in the mirror neuron system and action observation at Queen Square. He's still actually at Queen Square at the moment. So this is just, if you like, again, foundational literature placing the mirror neuron system center stage in terms of this kind of account and the focus of your experiments in terms of revealing evidence for these generative models that must include a model of my embodied self as part of my lived world. What was even more interesting, I think, from the point of view of James's contributions, that he subsequently went on to test the hypothesis that, well, let me just reverse a second. If it is the case that to be able to predict and make sense of something, to perceive something, I have to be able to do it, then if I see something that I cannot do, I will be surprised because I can't predict it. I'm going to have an uncertain posterior as to the causes of this. So what that means is, in principle, if you can't do it and you see somebody else doing it, you won't be able to see them do it. You just won't have that perception, very much in the Helmholtzian spirit, that, you know, to perceive something is to actually have it represented on the inside as a cause or an explanation for your sensorium. You can't perceive it unless it's part of your explanatory repertoire or your generative model, which means, in principle, if you lose the ability to do it, you won't be able to see it in other people. Which means if you've got Parkinson's disease and you have a psychomotor bradykinesia, or a poverty of movement that affects everything, including your facial muscles, you cannot express, you have a wooden sort of physiognomy, you have a wooden expression, you can't express emotions on the outside. And because you can't express them, in principle, after a sufficient amount of time, you won't be able to recognize them in other people. And this is exactly what James pursued with colleagues, and his friend Mark Edwards, who's done a lot of work on functional medical symptoms along these lines. Is this a plausible explanation for pathologies of embodied inference, where you've lost the capacity? So you talked before about people who could never walk. What about people who can't no longer walk? Will they have a different conception after a sufficient amount of time of when they watch somebody else walk, in the way that they used to be able to, but cannot do anymore? So some really interesting sort of psychopathological or neurological applications of this. So I thought you might be interested in that. That was Journal of Neurotransmission. What's this one? Oh yes, okay, good. So just in close then, is there any, yeah, we've done that one, sorry. Are there any experiments looking at ballet through the lens of predictive processing and or through ways of looking at the neurophysiological correlates of Bayesian surprise? Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a large literature in this area, which is good for you, but you do need to do a thorough Google search and pick out those which speak to what you want to speak to. You've already heard that there are other possible simpler finger tapping paradigms. You could go to Scott Kelso and look at the syncopation synchronization literature, and he's done quite a lot of work in terms of sort of dyadic coordination and in group synchronization, which is non-emotional kind of done without Chasky at the bottom of it. There's also a lot of interesting work in terms of rubber hand illusions and body ownership. However, you want to do ballet, so do ballet, because a lot of people also do ballet. And let me just, oh, sorry, the reason I put this one up, which I was, before we go into the studies of ballet, this notion that, I can author my own sensorium just by rehearsing my prior beliefs about the world should work, given my reflexes will actually realize those predictions and my prior intentions. If and only if I actually know how my body works, how my embodiment actually works. So that basically means when you're born, you have to spend the first few years learning what you can control, what you can cause, and what you can't cause in order to build the body model on the inside. So before you have a mirror neuron system, you've got to actually learn what things are controllable and what things are not. And that in itself is a really interesting, massive literature. And I just put this work up again by Scott Kelso, or more particularly Alicia here. They are actually currently working on active inference simulations of the baby mobile paradigm. So this is a paradigm, it's not a dance paradigm, but it's a little bit close, where you tie a mobile or a rattle to a baby's leg. And then you ask, what causes it to move? How does it forage for information in its environment? And the answer up until active inference was, oh, babies like stimulation, therefore they're going to rattle it. That's not, of course, minimizing Bayesian surprise. Maximizing Bayesian surprise would require you to act in a way that revealed the most evidence or the most information for whether you were causing the baby mobile to move or not. So the most efficient paradigm is to move and stop, move and stop, move and stop. And then that gives the most uncertainty reducing, that has the greatest expected information, and that's what babies do when you drill into it. So this is quite a recent PNAS, well, not that recent, 2023 paper, where they actually looked at this issue empirically. And then I think, I can't quite remember, I think they do discuss it explicitly in terms of active inference as a prelude to then actually modeling this in infants. So that would be if like a developmental perspective on your thesis. Where do these models come from? Well, a lot of hard epistemic foraging until you're about sort of 18 years of age, I imagine. So once you've done that, I just put 2 papers up here just to reassure you that this is practically very feasible. If you want to actually get people to dance whilst they are watching other people dance, then it's also possible to do that now with optically pumped magnetometers. Within the past year, that technology has come online. I don't think you need that. I think, and I wouldn't use fMRI. It's unnecessary. I'd use EEG because you can time lock the events to the onset of an unpredictable or unknowable kind of action. I think Christoph talked about reversing, and I actually thought he was going to say, you could actually reverse the video at one point, so so that the dance moves are actually impossible, and that would be define an event to which you could then time lock your EEG traces to then look at the amplitude of the evoked response, and then that amplitude scores the or it's a proxy for the Bayesian surprise. Basically, that's your dependent measure. But that would just require viewing videos, or viewing videos, I would imagine, of dance. So your independent variables would just be the within subject presentation of these oddball events, and between subject level there would just be the differing degrees of experience in either dancing or in being athletes or not. But people have used MEG in this instance to measure surprise during dance, and even they've actually done it in ballet dancers, eliciting correlates in this instance of muscular effort coding. But I think you can certainly repurpose this technology, at least this empirical setup, to, in a relatively straightforward way, elicit the same kind of data that you'd need to test your hypothesis. So, for example, in this instance, dancers and controls were shown ballet gestures and the effortful steps, which basically means things that I might not be able to do. So I may know they can be done, but I've never actually done them myself. Elicited a larger P300, and that refers to a late endogenous waveform that in the classical literature is usually associated with a redeployment of attention, and it's also known as a correlative novelty. So if you go to the classical literature, you've got this sort of you've come full circle. You can now relate the P3B to a novelty response. And of course, you've already defined novelty in the technical sense of the free energy principle as belief updating about the contingencies, the parameters, or the context in which you're using it. So this fits exactly with your thesis that the less easily imagined moves elicited greater novelty-related Bayesian surprise. Again, visuomotor regions are just those that are engaged in the mirror neuron system, which, if you remember, also includes the biological motion in area V5 in related regions in humans, MST in monkeys. So I think that if you can just look, sort of pick out this kind of evidence that's already out there and say, look, all this points to a really simple, very powerful, straightforward experiment with EEG that directly tests the hypothesis. And oh my God, I'm late. Right, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to stop sharing. Have I stopped sharing?
No,
Oh, I
yeah,
have.
now you
Yes.
stopped.
Would you mind if I go away? I've just noticed the time. I'm 3 minutes
No,
over
yeah,
here.
no. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Carl.
Thank you. Well, thanks for sharing, and what wonderful session. Sorry to have to
Thank
do
you.
this so soon. Bye.
Right. Perfect. Then I think it is another quick unmute and round of applause, Hector, for your brilliant presentation.
Thank you, Christoph. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Hector.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining and the very lively discussion. That was very joyful. Thank you so much. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you at the next TNB meeting, maybe on Monday, and have a lovely afternoon. And thanks again for joining today. And thank you, Hector, for presenting.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, guys.
Bye.
I think I didn't disengage myself now.
Bye.
They've done. Sorry, but I think we have to. Yeah, now.
Okay.
Okay.